you in the room who are with us for our first State of the Movement 2 years ago at the Green Lining Institute, can I ask you to stand, please? As folks stand, look around and note those who have traveled far to be with us today. For those of you in the room, please stand if you were with us for the second State of the Movement last year at the California Endowment. Thank you. As folks stand, note the folks from both movement and philanthropy who are here in the room with us today. For those of you in the room, please stand if this is your first State of the Movement. As folks stand, please welcome them. Let them know how glad you are they are here with us. Thank you all. You may be seated. Whether or not you've joined us for all three or attending for the first time, thank you. As being on the agenda post-lunch is a sleepy time of day, I appreciate your allowing me to keep your blood moving so we can stay energized for the program. 3 years ago, Justice Funders began these State of the Movement events to have the kinds of conversations we felt like we needed to have to make sense of the rapidly changing man-made and natural conditions in this world. And you all have humbled us with your desire to join in. Each year we have chosen a bigger venue to accommodate more folks, and each year registration for this event has had a Hamilton-like moment, and within 24 hours we've reached capacity. So that lets us know that you all want to have the kinds of conversations that we've been having, and so thank you. On that note, please join me and thank the sponsors of the event for this year's State of the Movement: Series Trust, 11th Hour Project, the Stepsky Foundation, Swift Foundation, Access Strategies, Solidarity Network, Common Council Foundation, and the San Francisco Foundation. Thank you all for helping us grow this event. For those of you on social media, you can follow along and contribute to the conversation at SOTM 2020. You can find the Twitter handles for the speakers in the event program, and I believe Mario is letting the folks on the stream know what's up. And now, to keep your side splitting, you may know him from NPR Snap Judgment or his work on the North Pole, or maybe from seeing him on the streets with Movement Generation. Please put your hands together for Mr. Josh Keely.
How do you enjoy life as the world is burning? When the planet is on fire and the country's falling apart, and half your neighbors are getting evicted or deported, and Tucker Carlson just said whatever the fuck Tucker Carlson said last night, what do you do? What do you do? I go to the water park with my nephew Miles. Miles is 12 years old. He is a brilliant, bow-legged troublemaker. I love him despite the fact that he's 12 and still has a rat tail. Shit's really not cute anymore, dude. We're not related by blood, but Miles' dad, Kevin, is like a brother to me. So Miles calls me Uncle Josh. Uncle Josh, when are we going to the Warriors game? Uncle Josh, will you show me how to open that car with a hanger again? Uncle Josh, yes. Uncle Josh, since I'm half black and half Asian, does that make me Blasian? Miles, that makes you Oakland. When in Rome. It's August 2014, and it's hot, which, as we know, for the weak-ass Bay Area means anything over 67 degrees. Today, y'all remember these heat waves? Today, it was 97. I'm over at Kevin and Miles' place in East Oakland, sitting in our tank tops and boxers watching reruns of Key and Peele. Forget this, I say. Forget this. Come on, fellas. I mean, I'm gonna take us somewhere we can cool off. Cooler than the movie theater, cooler than the mall. We're going to East Bay Water World. I see Miles' eyes light up. But then Kevin says, I don't know, you guys. You know those water parks, they're so wasteful. My man Kevin, love him to death, is the most annoying kind of Bay Area environmentalist. You might be familiar with the type, no one here in the room, of course. I say, Kevin, my dude, He's the type of dude, he's the kind of guy who comes over your house, uses the bathroom, doesn't flush, and instead writes a note on the toilet paper telling you how much water he's just saved. That's a true story every fucking time. I say, Kevin, my dude, it's so hot out here, I could fry an egg on your face, which I will if we don't go to East Bay Waterworld. Miles says, please, Dad. I say, please, Kev. Kev says, fine. Go have fun at the park, but take my car. It's a hybrid. So I grab the keys. And soon we're driving through Oakland. We pass the trilingual liquor store, the farmer's market that accepts food stamps. We go through the tunnel in the hills and emerge on the other side in the valley. The further we get from the coast, the ground gets drier and drier, browner and browner. The only green I see is the manicured lawns of the suburbs, the golf courses, the empty field of the sprawling county jail. And then we arrive at our Mecca in the desert, East Bay Waterworld. And y'all, I know it's even more beautiful than my heat-induced dreams imagined. There is a 50-foot waterfall. There's 4 wave pools. The air smells like chlorine and sunscreen and funnel cake. Delicious. Miles' mouth is wide, staring at all these things he's never seen before. Uncle Josh, this place is awesome. I know. We jump in the wave pool, we float the lazy river, we spin through the rapids until we're totally drenched, grinning ear to ear, and surprisingly thirsty. So I go to the funnel cake vendor for something to drink. Can I get a large bottle of water, please? Sure thing. That'll be $7. $7 for a bottle of water? Y'all got vodka in there? And I like this vendor because he checks the ingredients, like to see if, just in case. And he says, no, it doesn't look like it. It says this is bottled up near Lake Tahoe. This is California water. California water. I buy 2 bottles and head back to where I see Miles pointing up towards the sky. I follow his gaze, and then I see it. There, staring down at us from the tallest point in the park, is the largest water slide I've ever seen, the highest slide in Northern California, the Annihilator. The Annihilator, y'all might wonder, what the fuck am I talking about, this Justice Funders Conference? Don't worry, this is not an ad for a water slide. Stay with me. The Annihilator, or maybe it is, we'll see. The Annihilator is a 7-story, 80-foot free-fall drop-down, all in just under 5 seconds. Y'all know this type of slide. Maybe you take your kids, your nieces, your nephews. It's the kind of slide that's so vertical when you go off, your back comes off just a little bit when you go down. You feel if you lean over just a little, you're done. It's the type of slide that's illegal in 27 states and most of the European Union. But fuck it, this is California. We disrupt everything, right? Now, the worst part of the slide isn't the ride. As the parents and aunties and uncles in here know, no, the worst part is the 30-minute wait in line. Watching and hearing every kid go down the slide. Hearing every scream, hearing every shriek, hearing every, oh, sweet baby purple Jesus. That's a direct quote from a 5-year-old going down the slide. Shout out to Purple Jesus. Miles' hand grips the railing a little tighter on the steps. Uncle Josh, is this place safe? Before I can answer, I hear a loud voice shout from the top of the stairs. Hands up! It's the lifeguard, a tall white teenager in red shorts. He's yelling at a kid about to go down the slide. I'm telling you, it's way more fun if you put your hands up. And at that moment, those words hit me like a tsunami. Because it's August 2014. It's 2 weeks after Ferguson. after Mike Brown. It's 2 weeks after those words, hands up, became the calling cry for a movement. Right then and there in Missouri, people are putting their hands up to protest the police killing another black boy in America. I'm here in California watching kids put their hands up as they go down this slide called the Annihilator. It's August in America. In Detroit, they're shutting off poor people's water. California is suffocating of drought. Israel is bombing water treatment plants in Gaza. And in America, we have water parks in the desert. Industrial almond farms in the desert, prisons in the desert. Me and my family live right here in a desert trying to find anything that could be called an oasis. And Miles asked me if it's safe here. What am I supposed to tell him? I don't want to lie to my nephew. I want him to know that yes, in this land, some people will always see him in that skin as a threat, but I also want him to just laugh and play and go ride this crazy-ass water slide. How do you enjoy life as the world is burning? How do you navigate this transition that is so beautiful and so brutal at the same time? How do you teach your nephew to hate the park but love the ride? The thing is called the Annihilator. I think it might be trying to tell us something. And now we're next in line. In front of us, a girl with blonde pigtails shakes her head no. The lifeguard says, "It's okay. You don't have to do it." She steps back, and now Miles is up. He steps up, puts his feet in the rushing water. I can see the brown hills in the distance, Oakland on the other side and all her beautiful contradictions. I wave at Miles. I say, "You got this. You've got this, dude." He waves back at me, and when he does, he lets go of the rail. His hands shoot up in the air. The rushing water carries him away. He shoots and disappears over the edge. My nephew! I rush to the side and look over. And there's Miles at the bottom of the slide, safe and alive and pulling up his bathing suit. He jumps up and runs to get back in line. And the cycle continues. Water, blood, life, death, and maybe, someday, rebirth, regeneration. I'm still on the top platform of the slide. I walk to the edge, put my feet in the water, look down at California, lift my hands, and let go. Thank you.
Chibisanway, Morningstar Gali, Ilagatage Chi'i, Ma Ajumawi is Chi'i. My name is Morningstar Gali, and I am Ajumawi Band of Pitt River. I was born and raised here in Oakland, California, a few miles away at a place called the Aim for Freedom Survival School, the American Indian Movement. It was the AIM House that was run by the same warriors that had participated in the takeover of Alcatraz Island. And so as we're here today on Ohlone lands and territories, and so there's different names and village areas that we want to acknowledge of Chochenyo and Muwekma and the areas here of the Confederated Tribes of Lisjan right here in the East Bay area. We want to acknowledge the Ohlone peoples and the Coast Miwok peoples, the Yokuts peoples and the Patwin peoples that are here in the surrounding area of what is known as the Ohlone Bay. And so there's also a history here of the San Francisco Bay Area, and that's a history of resistance. There was a time of termination and relocation eras that took place where there was a flood of peoples that came in from all different tribes across the country. And they came here to the San Francisco Bay Area, and they were given promises of jobs, and they were given promises of housing, and to have their children in a safe school, and to be able to build a life. And when they arrived, they realized that those promises were unfulfilled. And so right here in the San Francisco Bay Area, we're now at a time where we've had some waves of gentrification and waves throughout the time of colonization. So I think about, this is a time of January in 1849, over 170 years ago, where bounties were being placed on our heads as California Native peoples. And it was the first governor of California that placed a $1 million bounty on our heads in exchange for gold. We were enslaved, and our children were enslaved at that time. And so what does that look like for a regenerative economy right here in California? How do we right these wrongs here within the San Francisco Bay Area when we're talking about gold, greed, and genocide, and the blood on the land that goes as far as the sea here, that goes as far as our bay? So I just want to acknowledge that. I want to acknowledge that we're at a time here where we've been celebrating the 50-year anniversary of the Alcatraz occupation. So I attended a school that's still in place today. It's right up here in the Oakland Hills. It's called Hint Hill Kuka, and it's the little red schoolhouse. And so Hint Hill's teachers were our teachers. They were the students of the Alcatraz occupation, and they're still here today. Our children still go to these schools today. And so I want to, just acknowledge that and talk about the history of the resistance here. I moved away from the San Francisco Bay Area in 2010. I could no longer afford to live here with the housing crisis. And I wasn't the only one that left. 1/4 of the tribal and intertribal populations here in the San Francisco Bay Area also left at that time. And there still, is a return back to our our rural tribal communities, to our reservation homes. And then we come back. 2 of my children are in school here in Oakland, and 2 of them are with me in Sacramento. And so I just think about, what it is that our children continue to deal with in this day. As California Native peoples, we are still fighting for visibility. There are 109 federally recognized tribes here in California, but there are over 50 tribes that are not afforded federal recognition. And what does that look like in an economy that is the 5th largest economy throughout the world? Where, as California Native peoples, we are still fighting for that visibility. Today, we are still fighting to be seen. We are still fighting to be recognized. What does that look like in terms of building these new economies? And how is that in line with our traditional ways and our traditional values? And so we know that it's all political. This is prime real estate, just as at the LA metropolitan area, just as the California coastline, just as the Sacramento Valley, that this is why our tribes here are not afforded federal recognition. And so there's different ways here in the San Francisco Bay Area that you can support through honor taxes and through the different land trust initiatives. But I just want to give that acknowledgement today of what that looks like. I just want to also acknowledge that our elders, I spent this past weekend in an Indigenous peacemaking ceremony with our relatives that are visiting from Mauna Kea. And our elders, our kapuna, have been up there on the mountain on the sacred Mauna for 5 months now. It's 20 degrees. They will stay there as long as they need to. But when we're in these spaces, if we're not talking about the foundation that's right here within the Bay Area that we need to be challenging, that we need to be standing up to in order for the divestment to take place. There's commitments that have been made by people right here in this room and these conversations that we are having, that this is not Western science against Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous values. This is American values not being in line with our Indigenous and traditional ways of life. And so again, I want to take the time to not only acknowledge the land and the peoples of the Ohlone peoples, but to acknowledge the history of resistance and how far that we still need to go. So, tolo.kwaitu.com, all my relations.
Thank you, Morningstar, for grounding us in the notion that remembrance is practiced through action. And that when we talk about regeneration, the first peoples have taught us about how to live and work from a place of caring and sacredness while modeling resiliency and self-determination. 2020 marks the 10 years that the Bay Area Justice Funders Network has been in existence. From our founding, it was always one of our values to be movement accountable. In the days following the murder of Oscar Grant by BART police at Fruitvale Station, our founding steering committee hired me, and for 4 years we worked to build across silos, develop transparent relationships, and mobilize philanthropic resources for movements. Then in 2015, our movement allies were beginning to articulate their vision for a world organized around caring and sacredness, where through regeneration and cooperation, we could create ecological and social well-being. And they asked us to be accountable to help facilitate a just transition for philanthropy. What that necessitated for the Bay Area Justice Funders Network was for us to actually see the larger movement ecosystem we were operating in, beyond the one here in the Bay, to develop a deeper analysis about the depth of change that is required for philanthropy to align their culture and practices with movement priorities, and to reimagine the role of a philanthropic affinity group. Once we learned about some of the amazing work you'll be hearing about this afternoon, we knew we could no longer only support incremental change to grant-making practices within philanthropic institutions that continue to accumulate wealth and power, causing harm to the very communities they seek to support with their grant dollars. We knew that we also needed to support the emergence and growth of new systems in the cracks of the old. This is why we evolved into Justice Funders 2 years ago, to support the transformation of the philanthropic sector to redistribute wealth, democratize power, and shift economic control to communities. So if I may, I want to share some of what we've been learning during our journey. In the last decade, we have seen our movements powerfully connect and call for the dismantling of white supremacy, capitalism, patriarchy, and colonialism through Black Lives Matter, We Are the 99%, Me Too, Standing Rock, Mauna Kea, etc. We know that in order for philanthropy to match the boldness of our movements, we must also participate in the dismantling of these systems of oppression, which means we must grapple with how these systems don't just exist in the world for our grant dollars to solve, but how they're deeply embedded in the culture and practices of our own institutions. Through Justice Funders consulting practice, we have learned alongside of the Women's Foundation of Oregon and Meyer Memorial Trust about how to transition our relationships from ones of domination and extraction to interdependence and regeneration. Our work with the East Bay Community Foundation reflects the possibility of a 90-plus-year-old organization to move from a primarily donor services approach to a transformative donor organizing framework that stewards the political journeys of their donors to align with the vision and practice of movement priorities. This is one of the ways in which Justice Funders is working to support philanthropy and calibrating its response to match the boldness, innovation, and systems change strategies of our movements. In the last decade, we have seen our movements take on the responsibility of managing their own funds because our foundations haven't been able to deliver. We know that in order for philanthropy to take a proactive role in support of a regenerative economy, we must develop practices that support the collective capacity for communities most impacted by extraction to produce from themselves. Justice Funders launched our Maestra cohort for philanthropic executives and trustees this past year, and together with our cohort members have been working towards transferring investments from the market economy and investing in local, sustainable economic projects. This is another way that Justice Funders is supporting philanthropies to operationalize the redistribution of wealth, power, and other resources from the communities in which they were extracted. In the last decade, we have seen an increase in inequity and a greater accumulation of wealth, land, and power by the 1%, including the amount of time, attention, and control they and those of us who work in philanthropy have within our movements. That culture that philanthropy has perpetuated onto our movements is one in which civic life is a product to be consumed rather than a way to be in deep relationship with one another. In order for these dynamics to not decimate our efforts, we need to build our movement's capacity to engage more people as deeply but decoupled from their access to capital. One way that Justice Funders is working to foster more resilience and interdependence in our movements is through our Movement Commons campaign. Last year, we engaged 93 development directors from over 70 movement organizations in their local ecosystems to reimagine and practice transformative, regenerative, and collaborative approaches to building power. This is another way that Justice Funders is working to accelerate the transformation of our relationships to communities. Strong relationships build a culture of interdependence and facilitate our capacity to build vibrant ecosystems where we can all thrive. For those of you on the stream and in person who have joined us in these endeavors, thank you. We know that our vision for philanthropy to redistribute wealth, democratize power, and shift economic control to communities is a collective effort. And as you listen to today's conversation, I invite you to think about how you and the organizations that you are a part of can play a role in facilitating a just transition, in working to democratize the power and control your institution has, in supporting the development of new infrastructure, or aligning your institution with the visionary strategies for a regenerative economy that we're about to hear about. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming my colleague, Amaka Agbo, who will contextualize and ground us in the components of a restorative and regenerative economy for this afternoon's conversations. Amaka.
Thank you, Dana. Thank you, Justice Funders, for having me. Thank all of you for being here. I'm going to give you guys a little bit of transparency. I'm really nervous, and I realized I was really nervous because as I look around the room, there's so many people that I've worked with over the years. We've worked on policy campaigns, we've done organizing together, we've developed projects together. And I've tried to figure out what's the one thing that I can say to make this click, to really shift the way we move money and resources. And the truth is, I don't know that there's any one thing that I can say. I think what I can offer you is to invite you into my truth, tell you a little bit about my story, and hope that something in that story resonates with you and unlocks something that hasn't been tapped into just yet, that helps you to think about how we can do our work differently and do it better and stronger together. And so to do that, I'm going to do something a little different. I am going to tell you guys about my land story. How many of you guys have heard of money stories or have engaged yet? So, typically we go through a process, we kind of talk about our relationship to money, how we came to engage with wealth or lack thereof. But I wanted to talk about land because it's something that has come up recently again for me in my life. And yeah, I think it's a good entry point for our conversation today. So my land story starts in Nigeria. I'm from the Igbo people. My parents grew up in Enugu State. And my dad, when he graduated the University of Nsukka, he was gifted his first piece of land in our village. His house, well, this is his second house, but his first house was right across the compound from his father's. And what essentially happened there is that we have a patrilineal system where our family, our extended family from many, many generations pass land down through the sons in the family. And so when he graduated, he was gifted this land not because he graduated, but because there was land, it was time to redistribute it, and he was next in line. I want to contrast this to the story of how my family came to have access to land in the States. I primarily grew up in San Luis Obispo, and in 1992, my mother and I were in a really bad car accident. This car accident meant my mom went to court, she got a settlement, and the settlement is what allowed my parents to put a down payment on their house. This is a house that we still have, it's a house that we go home to for the holidays. I share these stories not because I think the experience of the way we steward land in Nigeria is perfect, right? I have issues with the fact that it's a patrilineal system, right? And the fact that my dad knows that I am very eager to figure out what it looks like for me, the third daughter, to really figure out how I can actually have a way in to this family system. I mean, we've had conversations, and he's open to it, and he knows, and we're gonna work it out. It's not perfect, but what it points to is the fact that our family has found something that is sacred, that we've committed to as a resource to be shared and nourished and cared for across generations, and not a commodity. Most recently, when I was talking to my dad about it a couple of weeks ago, he called me because one of our extended families had hit some hard times, and they actually wanted to go back to the clan, clan with a C. They wanted to go back to the clan and really talk about what does it look like to be able to sell their land so that they could have some income. And so in response to this, everybody in the village got together and decided that they were going to create a trust to be able to support individuals so they actually wouldn't have to sell their land, because land has been the way that we've been able to really engage in self-determination in our village. And so he called me to kind of see if I'd engage in the trust, and I was like, yeah, but if I get my land, you know. All that to say, in the States, my parents worked really, really hard. You know, both my parents have graduate degrees. Even at the time in which my parents purchased the house, my dad was a professor at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo of electrical engineering. I lift this up to say that many of us work very, very hard. And the difference, though, is that the reason my parents were able to actually buy a house in San Luis Obispo is because of the unfortunate luck that my mom got in a car accident, and she had enough money all at once to put a 20% down payment on a house. We have systems that either recognize that from the time that we are born, we are worthy of being cared for and loved, or we have systems that say, yeah, you could work really hard, you could pull yourself up by your bootstraps, but unless you kind of get a settlement, unless you fall into money, or in my dad's case, my dad quite literally won the lottery. He won a student visa lottery to actually come to the United States to study. It was a gamble that he actually ended up being able to be here, and that I'm actually able to be here on stage with you. So many of us work hard. Those of us that actually lost our homes in the 2008 recession worked hard, but we had a system that privileged profit over people and over the planet. And so that's my story. That's kind of, you know, as I kind of engage in this work, I unearth more around my history and all the different paths that converge for me to be here. And I think the opportunity for us to dig into are what are the systems that actually recognize that we are all sacred, that we are worthy, that we are deserving. And we get to actually question, are we actually engaging with systems right now that honor and recognize that? I would say that we don't. Part of the reason I actually pulled out this quote is, one, because it resonates with me. And I know, you know, we just had Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Day. MLK resonates with a lot of people, so maybe if he talks about capitalism, it'll be more palatable and we can figure out what we're gonna do. But the reality is that I think it's time that we actually start talking about the C word, that we start actually questioning whether this system is working. I think we know that it's not. I think when we watch the news every day, we're very clear that this is a system that is no longer working. And as the quote says, systems don't change themselves. It takes brave and bold individuals to stand up and do something. It takes those individuals, those organizations and people that we're going to hear from later this afternoon to be the ones to say that enough is enough, that the policy needs to change, that we're going to rethink how we use money, that we're going to actually be in a different way of relationship to one another. So the invitation for all of us is to figure out, what is our act of civil disobedience? What is our act of direct action? What are we willing to actually do and challenge within our institutions, within our organizations, recognizing that the policies that we adhere to are ones that we made, and therefore ones that we can change. So all this to say, this is kind of a little bit the truthiness of who I am and what brings me to this work. So my work on restorative economics is very much rooted in, hold on, I missed a slide. There we go back. My work in restorative economics is very much rooted in the framework of restorative justice. Restorative justice being a practice that has been popularized in the Bay Area, that has been inspired by indigenous communities committed to community building and holding circles. What I appreciate about restorative justice as a practice is that it calls us into accountability for our actions. It invites us to engage in a practice of reconciliation and then commit to understanding what repair looks like. I would say that we have an economic system that has created significant harm all around. And the invitation for us is to figure out, what does accountability look like? What is our act of reconciliation? And how do we begin to repair? So for me, restorative economics has been helpful in thinking about, it's not just creating a new regenerative economy, but really thinking strategically about who we are investing in and how we are investing in them. And so my work really looks at starting off with, how do we actually create opportunities for community stewardship? How do we actually question the ways in which we look to individual riches as the model for how an individual kind of makes it in the world? And really figure out, what does it look like for all of us to make it? How do we hold each other in community? And then the other piece being, what does it actually look like to govern? I recently learned of a statistic that put out that 43% of Americans in the United States live in poverty. 43%. But we have a democratic system where it takes 51% to actually shift policies on the federal scale. So all things being equal, let's say we don't have voter suppression, let's say we don't have Citizens United, let's say we don't have people undermining our elections. If we were all to turn out and vote in our interests, we would essentially be saying that it's okay for that 43% to continue to live in poverty. The invitation to really rethink democracy and rethink governance, to be one in which we are actually taking care of all of us together and understanding that we all thrive together. So my work is to support community-owned and governed projects, and understanding that the projects are not just about more people owning more things together, which at the same time I think is pretty cool, I'm not mad at it, but really understanding that that asset, the way we're really shifting the resources and wealth, is what allows us to then leverage and build economic power, political power, and cultural power. And those are the things that make it possible for us to access self-determination and sovereignty, in spite of understanding that there is a global capitalist system that we're navigating within, right? Even back home in Nigeria, even though in our village we have that system for stewarding land, I would say we would look at the way that multinational corporations have operated in Nigeria. So we actually get to navigate contradictory economic systems and figure out what it looks like to be in relationship in the totality of all of it. So yes, like I mentioned, I think first being able to start with the opportunity of acknowledging and figuring out where we got our wealth. So this slide is something that I picked up from Movement Strategy Center. I think I saw Mimi and Taj in the back. The nested layers of human transformation was a helpful way for me to understand, what does it look like for individuals that want to do things differently, to also be able to engage in shifting systems and shifting cultures and structures and institutions. And one of the things that's really clear for me is that first we have to actually sit with understanding, what are the habits and patterns, right? What are the ways in which we just unknowingly continue to allow things to progress and persist the way that they've always been? We have an economic system that continues to focus in on extraction of wealth and resources. We also have an economic system that's committed to the exploitation of labor at all costs. That's a habit and pattern. We don't even think about it anymore, right? And I think if we were to even open up the Resonance book, we could actually start to look at, what are the habits and patterns of philanthropy, right? What are the ways that we actually need to understand? Like, we've just told ourselves the 5% is what we need to do, and that's all we need to do. A friend of mine, Lynn, pointed out to me in a meeting earlier this week that even the language of philanthropy is only talking about the 5%. Some of us are engaged in institutions and foundations that actually have endowments. The word philanthropy doesn't even presence that other 95% of how it's invested and endowed. So we're actually even invisibilizing what's happening over there. So what are the ways we actually need to identify these habits and patterns, and then be conscious about the choice points, and understand that the consciousness and actively engaging in choice is then what allows us to identify the new embodied practices that we want to be in, right? So as we move from an extractive way of engaging in philanthropy and foundations and financial institutions, we have to be in a place of intentional choice to do something differently, to actually get over to that regenerative side and the transformational side. And that, yeah, the process of governance is actually really key to this. So when that individual kind of came to the rest of the family and said that we need to sell the land, they needed to sell the land, you know, people could have been like, okay, yeah, go do what you got to do, figure it out. But instead, they decided to develop a mechanism that allowed us to identify this is an impacted person in our community. And we want to offer a solution that actually helps to center them, because we understand that if we center them and find something that keeps them held and loved in our community, that's actually better off for all of us together, right? And so there's an opportunity for us to think about how do we move policies, how do we shift systems so that we're holding that 43%, so that we're holding that impacted person and not forcing them to have to actually go at it alone, but really lifting up the governance structures that really do believe that when we center the needs, the voices, and the power of impacted populations, we're actually all better off together. And that with this, for me, this work must always be grounded in social movements. I will say that one of my pet peeves are outsiders, social entrepreneurs that will sometimes come into community and say, I see your problem, I'm gonna tell you what to do, and this is just how you need to fix it. Let's actually be in a relationship and understand what the opportunity is to figure out how social movements are working together to build power. Because this work is not just about the redistribution of wealth. This work is about building power and ensuring that those that have not had access to it have the autonomy to make decisions for themselves. And so with this, the piece around cultural power is really key. Cultural power is a thing that allows us to be seen and visibilized, that allows us to actually stand in our full humanity and our dignity. And the ability to support projects that are deeply rooted in community and rooted in culture is a thing that allows us to actually shift out of systems that support and prop up white supremacy to those that actually can kind of create a multitude of cultures within a community. Oh, it's going fast. And that the way that we engage in culture then allows us to think about how are we moving goods and resources throughout a community, right? How are we actually building that economic power? And building the economic power in a way that we're not extracting more value out of community than we're leaving behind, but we're actually rethinking what does this community need to be able to thrive? And how do we move resources in a way that are respectful to that? And that's also then what allows us to build the political power. It's what allows us to fight. And our ability to actually exercise political power, that we can actually go and say that this is a policy now that can be upheld in the court of law, that we actually have rights to stand on, is what's key to actually creating transformation. And so really understanding that all the ways we build power together are critical. And being able to support communities where we visibilize their culture, their identity, their values, where we're actually engaging in moving capital and resources in a different way, and that we're supporting their ability to actually have true political power for themselves, is what starts to actually shift the way we move our systems and the way we move our economy. So in short, this is the work that I do. And I would say that I try to be generous, flexible, and gracious about how I apply this framework when I'm working with groups, because I understand we're learning and we're iterating. And the ability to actually be able to hold a number of different strategies, the ability to actually be able to support projects and taking a risk and saying that we're still going to stand with you in that solidarity is the work that I get to do. This is a helpful framework for me to think about how do I stay true, grounded, and accountable to the communities that I serve. And so The last thing I'll share with you is I've recently been very privileged and honored to work with a great team of individuals. I see Marnie, Rosen, I think see Donna, Bradsford, I saw Lynn in her beautiful hot pink dress, to really come together and think about, sorry, I'm having a hard time with this. We are working on a new project. We're working on a new family foundation called the Keely Foundation. We don't have a website yet, so don't Google us. But the four of us get to work together and really wrestle with what does it look like to do and engage in philanthropy differently. Lynn and I get to work together on an integrated capital fund, Lynn representing the Candide group as part of this project. I think I see the Candide table over here as well as part of the project. We get to actually think about how are we moving the philanthropic dollars as well as the investment capital to support projects to understand what do you truly need to make this project a reality. And so this is an exciting opportunity for us to think about what does it actually look like to engage and work with donors that decenter themselves and their decision-making process? What does it look like to have 3 different projects? Marnie's really anchoring our environmental justice body of work. We have Donna, who's heading up our mindfulness body of work, and Lynn and I are working on the Restorative Economies Fund. And those 3 projects, we're all taking different strategies to how we support communities. But the ability to understand that within one organization, we can actually create the spaciousness to experiment, to be in a place of practice around how we actually redistribute wealth and capital. And so as we're on this kind of learning journey, we look forward to kind of sharing more with all of you as we're building out this body of work. And we hope to be in partnership with not just our peers in philanthropy, but our peers in foundations and financial institutions to really help to radically redistribute wealth, to really think through how we can be the individuals that are helping to shift systems. In closing, one of the pushbacks I get on my work the most is people are like, well, what if you give all this money away and it doesn't work? For me, at the end of the day, if all that we're able to do is ensure that more communities have access to land where they can have self-determined communities, is that we're able to actually move resources into community-governed funds where people are having a different relationship with money and capital that isn't rooted in trauma and extractiveness, that into itself is a shift. And so let's not act from a place of aversion to risk. Let's dream big, and let's not let our own limitations around what's possible limit the opportunities that those that are on the front lines and the grassroots that are moving. And so with that, I'm gonna set us up for our afternoon conversation. We're gonna be able to really listen into some intimate conversations. We set up 3 triads that will take place over the course of the afternoon. The first one will be Grassroots' vision for a solidarity economy and leveraging multiple forms of power. And so I'm gonna let you guys have the floor.
So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lisa Owens, and I am the executive director of an amazing housing justice organization in Boston, and in partnership and just friendship with the 2 people to my left and my right. We're part of the Right to the City National Alliance, and we're also part of the Solidarity Economy Network based in Boston, which you'll hear about in a second. And I have the distinction of being able to talk about the role of local organizing in the ecosystem that is trying to move towards a just transition into the new society. And so I want to start just by saying that we believe that local organizing and indeed social movement organizing for true systemic change, for the transition that Amaka was just talking about, moving from this extractive economy into a regenerative economy, the very foundation, the very engine that will get us there is the local organizing and the social movement building. And in my mind, the way that I think about it is that the organizing is sort of the protective community, the struggles, the experiments, the failures, and the successes create a protective barrier that allow these beautiful experiments, alternative experiments, to be seeded and to thrive. But without this protective barrier of social movement organizing and local organizing, then the beautiful experiments that we know about, the community land trust, the worker co-ops, et cetera, the family farms, are not able to thrive and are not moving us toward the new vision, the new society that we want, right? And so the role of local organizing is so important. So I'll talk just really briefly about my local context. So in Boston, our organization is part of an ecosystem that in essence, what we're trying to do through our very, very hyper-local organizing is to make what seems impossible now possible. And so we do that through local building organizing. So our work is fighting eviction by corporate landlords, by these big investors that are coming into our high-cost cities, our gateway cities, even now our rural communities, and trying to set up shop, set up casinos, set up big box stores, set up luxury high-rise towers, and evict the people who've lived there for 5 years, 10 years, 40 years, 50 years. So the local organizing is the barrier. We are the people who are most impacted, who stand up against these big corporations and say, not anymore, not anymore, building by building, block by block, neighborhood by neighborhood. And these victories, when we win, and remember, the law is not on our side. In places like Massachusetts, it's actually legal to evict somebody for no good reason. Just because I want more profit, I'm an investor and I want more profit. So even though the law isn't on our side, we fight and we win. Yeah. We win. Building by building, neighborhood by neighborhood, what happens when we win? We make the impossible possible. So what does that do? It opens us up. This possibility opens up new demands, transformative demands. It also opens up, though, this idea that we can do more than fight defensively. We actually can demand community governance. So in Boston, for example, the same people who have fought and won to stay in their buildings against all odds are the same people who came together across neighborhood to set up an alternative people's governance project, which we call our citywide People's Assembly. So this is an assembly of people across neighborhoods that look at planning and development, which in Boston is ridiculous. One city agency is in charge of both planning and development. We think it's wrong. And we say, no, we're going to do our own plan, our people's plan. That's what we call it, our people's plan. And together, quarterly, we're going to use this as an alternative space for people's governance, and that the city has to respond to us. This was not possible before the small victories, the organizing victories. And then, beyond that, we say, we are winning against these corporate landlords, but we have to keep going back after the contract runs out. We should be owning these buildings collectively. And so we created a People's Land Trust, a community land trust of occupied housing. These are homes that some of them we wrestled from the banks during the foreclosure crisis and put them on a land trust. And others we won through these battles with corporate landlords and said, you don't deserve the right to house our people. We house and govern ourselves. And so community land trust is another example of that. And so lastly, what used to be impossible in Massachusetts back in the 90s is now possible again. The idea that it's actually not okay for corporations to have unlimited carte blanche. They can raise our rents 50%, 100%, 200% if they want to in Massachusetts. And what used to be the third rail, rent control, is now on the table at a statewide level. Again, this was impossible 5 years ago, but because of the organizing, it is now possible. So that is, in a nutshell, hopefully you can see what the local organizing makes possible. And I want to ask Dawn. So Dawn, as the executive director of our national Right to the City Alliance, Dawn, you have the position of seeing what I've described in one tiny city in the United States. You have a national viewpoint. So I wonder if you could talk about what the trans-local organizing model makes possible.
Thank you, Lisa. Hey, everyone. Really honored to be here. Thank you, Justice Funders, for the invitation. Firstly, I will not be able to tell that story fully. We only have like 5 minutes. But I was debating with myself what the key aspects of this question are to share. So a couple of things. So one, I think that you know, the beauty and the strength of the translocal organizing is that we have a way of lifting up not just what's happening in Boston and Massachusetts, but it's happening all over the country, as Lisa's saying. We are seeing in this moment of kind of what is this crisis around real estate accumulation, which is a global phenomenon. We are seeing that there are communities all over the country that are doing the kind of resistance that Lisa just talked about. Now, the thing about the translocal model that we are trying to delve in at Right to the City is one where the idea is that you take really, really strong local organizing, as we've heard described by Lisa, and you actually need to cohere it with a collective national and international long-term vision and strategy. So it's actually not just that you have these disparate and specific local organizing projects and local organizing experiments that are happening, and that you just kind of tell a collective story and then that's the strategy. No, the piece of the assemblies work that Lisa talked about, you know, so she's describing that quarterly citywide assemblies are happening in Boston and have been happening for several years now to really do this work of collective struggle, collective alignment, collective thinking across the neighborhoods, and then coming together as a city. And then you want to imagine that happening across states, and then you want to imagine that happening nationally. So there's this ongoing assemblies program that Right to the City and Homes for All groups are doing all over the country, from the neighborhood level, in some cases at the block, at the level of blocks, to all the way to the national. And we really are digging into this idea that translocal organizing is also transformative. One, in that it needs to not just be a narrow housing movement, right? So at the assemblies, we have all kinds of things come up. We are encountering and actually trying to take on some of the struggle around patriarchy that is inherent, racism, internalized stuff between and within communities. There's a whole range of what are the kind of inherent systemic divisions between our communities and within our communities that the assemblies are an opportunity to engage, to build on. And this idea that you are also then doing this political work together where we struggle, we align, and we get more clear. So the last thing I'll say, because that was a sign for me, right, Jennifer? Yeah, right on. Okay, so the last thing I'll say then is that Lisa mentioned the local ecosystem, the local movement ecosystem, and I want to just talk about the national movement ecosystem for a minute. So we at Right to the City, we understand ourselves to be living within and advancing a national ecosystem. We see ourselves as one part of the land and housing and development front within the It Takes Roots formation, which is our sister alliances with the Indigenous Environmental Network, with Climate Justice Alliance, and with Grassroots Global Justice. We see ourselves in relationship and in movement ecosystem with the Rising Majority, and we believe strongly that these multi-front national formations have to then work together to do what we are attempting to do within our movement network, but we need to be doing this cross-sectorally, cross-geographies, and cross-peoples to be able to like really do this type of visioning, strategizing, and struggle together. So on that note, I'm gonna Jasmine pose you the final question, which is, what do you understand to be philanthropy's role in supporting, advancing, and growing this ecosystem that we've been talking about?
Hi everybody, I'm Jasmine Gomez. I'm the program director at Access Strategies Fund, and we're a part of the Solidarity Economy Initiative, so it's how I'm connected to everybody up here. Hearing you both gives me like a deep affirmation in understanding our role in philanthropy, and that's about shifting the power dynamics, making sure communities who've been most marginalized by systems of oppression are the ones actually making these decisions about what policies need to shift, how people need to shift, what new behaviors to engage it, what new systems to create. And ways that we can do that is through collectivizing resources and giving resources to community, but also really when we even think of how we're interacting with community, thinking about shifting all of those structures and ways of being. And so an example that I have in the Boston area, and I'm in the Boston area, is the Solidarity Economy Initiative. And so there's a cohort with City Life Vida Urbana and amazing other groups that are doing really radical, beautiful work in building solidarity economies. And sometimes that looks like public land ownership, sometimes that looks like cooperatives, and sometimes that just looks like completely shifting the policy and the culture of who we are and how we interact and how we engage. And so initially when the Solidarity Economy Initiative was created, we had a kind of joint leadership where it was funders and grassroots groups, and collaboratively we'd have decision making as to what is it that we're going to be focusing on the year, how are we going to engage in learning, unlearning, and re-remembering and relearning and all of these things. And after 3 years, I came in to the scene and we started talking about what's the next iteration? How are we going to make sure that we're continuing to give power to the community groups? And so we shifted the governance structure, which is something that we talked a little bit about. And so with the Solidarity Economy Initiative, we said anything that has to do with the grassroots movements, the priorities that they're going to be asking for, the policy shifts that they're going to be asking for, even the way that accountability is held and the way that the grants are given should actually all be under the grassroots control. So we shifted the governance structure so that there was grassroots leadership to have that control and make those decisions, and we make sure that we're there to offer support and programmatic support largely, but really have the grassroots groups lead and all of that stuff. And then we also thought, well, we need to get more resources because the grassroots groups are doing amazing work. And we need to make sure that they're well-resourced enough to be able to engage in experimentation, and that we are shifting our expectations and our measurable impacts and all of these things so that we can allow for that experimentation to happen and move from a place of abundance and not a place of scarcity. So when we came together, we thought, how is it that we're going to be actually approaching funders, philanthropists, and actually getting them to be willing to shift so much individually, institutionally, collectively, to make sure that we can actually move in this direction and build transformational spaces. And so we thought there's like so much beautiful content, educational materials, and people who are really doing amazing work. But what we needed was a localized space, a circle really, for all of these funders, philanthropists, and just people with wealth, people from movement generation, et cetera, to come together and really do the unlearning and relearning themselves. And so I think that that's been a big parallel that we've had with with the grassroots groups in ways, and that there was like this whole process of learning that they're engaging in, but we as funders were not engaging in that same process, and we realized that was actually really necessary. And so our role, really expanded too, because now as funders, as philanthropists, we recognize the need to organize other people in philanthropy to do the same. So our role in the ecosystem isn't just about shifting the power and collectivizing resources to give it to other folks, but it's also about how are we making sure that other people in positions of power are also doing the same? How are we organizing our own folks? And this, looks really different. In Boston, it looks really like orienting, sitting in circle, having an altar, talking about the history, the indigenous history, acknowledging tribes and the land, where everything is coming from, also looking to other communities, other countries, seeing how they're engaging in cooperativism, and really reflecting back and bringing that all in to the space, and so that we're not replicating the ways of being when we're engaging together, as well as shifting our practices and the policies and these broader institutional changes that need to be had. So yeah, really we're looking to shift values, mindsets, expectations, ways of being, ways of giving, ways of investing, even theories of change within philanthropy, and creating a space and a container to do that locally is a really important thing for us in Boston to kind of help build that field.
So we're gonna use our time to have a conversation about infrastructure. And not infrastructure just in how we think about kind of scaffolding, but what are the ways we develop the relationships that really help to hold this work together? And so I'm really excited to be joined by these amazing individuals to have this conversation. They invited me to kind of Vanna Black through it all, so I'm gonna do all of it. Is there another microphone? Oh, cool. Awesome. We'll pass it down. Oh, there we go. There we go. So I'm gonna start off with you, Canuck. We're gonna have a great conversation, and I wanted to first see if you could take a moment to kind of tell us how you decided to kind of leave your corporate life and now find yourself as an urban farmer, someone committed to sustainable agriculture. Why do you actually see that engaging in land directly is kind of key to self-determination when at first you had other economic means to actually support your family and do that work?
All right, so for me, why I see it as the key to self-determination is because it's really just a shift from an extractive economy to a regenerative economy. And the reason why is because working my corporate job, I used to work in the IT world. I used to work in these big data centers, probably the size of 10 of these rooms, with a bunch of computers that probably pull more energy in a day than most households use in a year, right? And so every day I was extracted from my family and I was extracted from my community. And I would work 8, 10, 12, 15 hours a day, drive 30 minutes up, 30 minutes back, and then go home. I wouldn't have time with my family. I wouldn't have time with my community. I grew up in a community that's a food desert, or a food apartheid community is what the word is now. And there was nothing I could do. I didn't have any time to be there. In 2007, the crash happened. And I realized that I had all this information in my head about how to make these computers do all these different things. But if somebody turned off the electricity, I had no use. I could not grow food. I couldn't swing a hammer. I could barely even change a light bulb, you know. I knew how to mow grass, though. That was something that I got under control pretty good. And so looking at that, you know, I planted a seed in my backyard. Just kind of giving a little story, both my parents have had cancer, and I saw the eating habits that they passed on to me, so I started to change them. I had a friend of mine who, after getting off the medicine and changing to a vegetarian diet, that he was able to pretty much stop the onset of multiple sclerosis and is now walking around and talking just like either of us are doing here today. So I saw that power. And so in wanting to reduce my food bill, I just planted some seeds in the backyard. And so I started killing a bunch of plants at first start, because you don't start a garden in Sacramento in July, but that's a whole different story that, you know, we don't have time to go into today. And then at that same time, there was something special that happened, is that I met my wife. And so her grandmother, mother, herbalist. So while she was killing plants in her balcony, right, and killing herbs, trying to grow herbs, I was killing plants, and so we came together and we decided that we wanted to start maybe trying to bring some life to these plants that we were trying to grow. And that's what we did over there in our community and in our backyard. And so in doing that, there was these other things that took place. I'm just trying to reduce my food bill. Very individual, very selfish. But then as we started to work together with the family, and as we started to go outside and harvest food and cook and start to spend 75% of our time outside when we were together as opposed to being inside watching TV, I saw different changes in the community, different changes in the way that our family practiced community with each other. So I realized all of these other things that are rarely ever talked about what happens when you get on land and start to practice agriculture. And so for me, you know, by 2011, I was like, I'm doing this for the rest of my life. And so I rescued myself. And I think it was almost like, walking through the wilderness and coming out of Egypt and walking through the wilderness, going to the promised land, right? And so as I came back into my backyard and I started to do this full time, I was able to start being involved not only in my family's life, but in the community's life. And so at the Yisrael Family Urban Farm, they call me the chief seed starter, right? And so it's not just about the seeds that are planted in the ground. On our farm, we started a neighborhood association. You know, there's so many different things that now I'm able to do in my community because I'm now there. And agriculture is the way that we're able to do that. So that's why I see this as a way of self-determination in the garden.
Cool. I appreciate that.
Thank you. One more?
I got one more for you. So, you know, as we were kind of chatting, as we were waiting for the event to start, we were talking about how a lot of people from the Bay Area are moving up to Sacramento because of the cost of living, because they're actually able to go up to Sacramento and buy a home. Right. So as you're kind of engaging people around this piece on sustainable agriculture and rethinking the relationship to land, I'm curious about how do you engage your neighbors in really rethinking land as a commodity, right? As something to be speculative, and starting to engage them around what it means to actually collectively steward and own the land that you guys are all taking care of together.
I just invite them over to my house. It's one thing, you know, when you grow up in a community like mine, and when the things that you see on a day-to-day basis are corner stores, empty lots, fast food restaurants. You know, I can walk from one end of my community to the other and I can hit 7 corner stores, but I can't find any type of vegetables. I can't find lettuce, but I can find everything else that's bad for you. And then you see empty lots with different types of paraphernalia, different things that are going on there. And then, of course, if I'm like, okay, maybe I want to eat out today. And then, you know, around the box of my neighborhood, there's like fast food restaurants everywhere. And so what I say to young people is that if you're able to miss the drive-by, don't forget about the drive-through, right? And so when I bring people over to my house and they see the farm, they see the food forests, they see the area where we have ceremony and we burn fires and do rituals. They see, the chickens, all these different things. Then people tell me that it's like I've just left the neighborhood and I've went into this new world. And in that place, there's a revisioning of what's possible. And so that's how I'm able to show people something different. And so where we are right now is we're at a space to where we are being a catalyst for people to look at a revisioning of land use within a community that, according to the newspapers, has been forgotten. And so from there, we're now ready to start to scale that and to start to be able to practice economic development. We've been able to hire people from our community. We practice growing food, of course. We actually help people and show them how to get their own gardens. There's a process where they learn, and then once they go through those things and they're ready, then we'll actually help them along with other community people, community folks in the neighborhood on their same street to put in a garden and then be able to maintain it. Then, of course, you have to learn how to cook. So then you cook. We have cooking classes. So everything that we did in our backyard with our family are the things that we now share out to the community. And so when people experience that, then all of a sudden they see a new future, a new vision, and that's when the magic takes place.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So my next question is for my beloved Carissa Lewis.
Hello. Also, Amaka is not just here to be our Vanna Black. Amaka is instrumental in a lot of the Black land work that we're doing. Okay, I'm ready to answer your question.
All right. That's that sister love, y'all. So Chris, I'm hoping that you can take a moment to really talk to us about how Black land and power were coming together to really rethink and reimagine an infrastructure, a way of organizing ourselves that's actually rooted in a vision for Black liberation. And as we're talking about land, if you can also take a moment to really lift up why land is actually important to Black liberation and how we're engaging in that with our work.
Yep. First, I am Carissa. I'm from Oakland. Welcome. I'm a Black radical farmer, the youngest daughter of Gordon Cole, rest in peace, and Patricia St. Ange. It's important that I name the shoulders that I stand on. So Octavia Butler says that there is nothing new under the sun, but there are new suns. And so we believe that we are in a second, an iteration of folks who have seen the connection between Black liberation and Black land, whether it be W.E.B. Du Bois or Fannie Lou Hamer, and we walk in that legacy. So BLP is about, and I have my little cheat phone. I'm not texting, promise. BLP is about reclaiming land for Black people. It's about organizing Black landowners and stewards, both to think about different utilities for their land, as well as to invite folks to actualize a national Black land trust so that we're moving land out of speculation. And it's about building a Black land movement in order to shift policies and practices that contribute to the hemorrhaging of Black land. And so it's deeply important because if we understand the role of feeding of ourselves, of being able to have sites for movement building, there hasn't been an iteration of the Black liberation movement in the past that did not see the connection between land and power deeply connected. So I think, that answered part of the question. Good. I'm trying to be succinct and quick because Kelly got some good shit to say too.
So then moving into that, I'm wondering if you can talk to us about governance and how we're kind of rethinking governance in the space and why that has been such a key aspect to our work together.
Yep. So we have these pretty lofty visions around what it means to self-govern at scale. And in order for us to get to scale, we also have to practice internally. And so I, as many of y'all, are a fan of movement generation. One of the things that they teach us is that if you're not ready to govern, you're not ready to win. And I actually ran a program with movement generation 2 years ago, and in that program, we also, for me, it was kind of the seeds for the Black Land and Power project that we're currently working on. And so I'm gonna tell you a quick story. So they're, you know, we're direct action strategists. They're like earthy people. We come together to figure out how do we take earthy things with direct action. It's excellent. And so they're teaching us about the commons and shit. And so some of this language is like new to us, we don't understand it, but we're like, okay, let's manifest it inside of our week-long training. So instead of doing just general group agreements, we actually think about how are we gonna collectively govern ourselves together this week? Let's put it into practice. What is in the commons? Weed. Of course, weed is in the commons, y'all. Cannabis, it's in the commons. So all of the cannabis smokers, we come together. Sorry if this is great, you like it. Right, it's legal here. Y'all like weed. So all of the weed smokers come together, we pool our money, we get weed, then we identify a treasurer. This is not somebody who's going to micromanage our consumption, but just keep us updated on where we are in our consumption. And then we separated the weed into the amount of days that we were gonna be there. So day 1, day 2, day 3, and then we put it in a jar. And then we established some collective rules. If you wanna smoke, you need to have at least 5 other people who are ready to smoke with you, and you have to announce it so that if anybody else who wasn't in the original 5 wants to, they can come join you. Hey y'all, I'm gonna roll up. Cool, my 5 people, it's time to roll up. So we're all excited. We're like newly trained up, feeling excited about commons and fuck capitalism. And so we, oh shit, put the sign down. Damn it, 5 minutes. Okay, I'm gonna be quick. My story's almost over. So we separate the weed. We had left a little bit out for that night to celebrate this new collective agreement. We go to bed, wake up, and 2 days' rations of the weed is gone. My God, it was a mess. So essentially what we had to do was figure out, 1, who the fuck took our weed? And most importantly, figure it out without replicating systems that are tearing us apart. And so, you know, our first reaction was like, pull out your pockets. We running through everybody's shit. Who got the weed? And then we were like, oh, that's an unlawful search and seizure. That's what the police do. And so we, you know, we were like, we're abolitionists. So we can't berate people. We can't, you know, so it was such an interesting example and opportunity for us to think about what does it mean for us to govern ourselves and to then hold each other accountable. And turns out it was none of us that took the weed. It was like some random friend of a staff person. It was wild, but we didn't take the weed. It was great. And so one of the things that we've done since then is whenever we come together in space, we don't just name random group agreements. Like, cool, 1 mic, we get it, but like, actually, how are we governing ourselves together this week? How are we making sure that the practices that we're putting in place are aligned with how we wanna be together in this new world that we're creating?
I could say some things, but I'm gonna keep moving to Kelly. So Kelly, you're participating in Black Land and Power technically with your Restorative Foundation hat on. And you know, you're also somebody who comes from a background in movement building. I'm curious if you could take a moment to really tell us what it is like, what does it mean for you to be able to show up in right relationship as somebody who has the experience of coming from movement, is still a part of movement, but also, you know, comes from a foundation and is a part of these conversations that we're having around governance.
Thank you. And Chris, you know I'm gonna get you back for making me follow you on that one, right? Okay, y'all. I have no weed stories. I'm not doing that Restorative Foundation. Nope, not I. But no, Amaka, thank you for that question. So All right, so this is, I'm going to take a cue from you in sharing my personal story and living, stepping into my truth, because I see so many of you out here that have helped me along my journey. I know many of you, and I'm just really honored and humbled to be here with you all, because we are collectively this movement, right? So, how do I answer that? Coming from, I'm so humble that I would not call myself an organizer. But, coming out of being in service of community and movement building and collective action, and coming into a space like philanthropy that, let's be honest, is set up to do the antithesis of that, okay? Has nothing to do with who you are, right? It does, but you need to recognize that the structures that are in place, okay, do not allow us, okay, to show up as our full selves, okay, within the current construct of philanthropy, okay? And I am here because I understand the power of calling people in, okay? Not calling people out. I do think that the bravest thing we can do every day when we find ourselves with the great privilege and honor of working within some of these philanthropic institutions is to have the courage to go on a journey to ask yourself, what will it mean for me to show up in this institution as my whole self every single day? Every single day when I am not only in my own individual skin, right? But every single day when I'm, in a staff meeting, every single day when I'm in the boardroom with my family members, with the Andrews family members, right? Whose endowment, right? I work on behalf of every single day. How can I be who I am, born and raised in the South Bronx, which is where I cut my teeth. Shout out to Hunts Point and The Point and those folks, right? How can I be that same person, right, within my role as philanthropy? And what that means is not pretending. I'm not pretending like I'm not walking within a certain construct of power. But what I am understanding is that I'm leaning into that. I'm owning it. I'm telling it like it is. And I am being transparent about what that means with my folks, right? And they still love me, and they still welcome me. It also means understanding that we need to shift our practice, right? And what does that look like, for me to show up in a BLP space, right? As Serdna. Well, to be honest, like when I showed up at our foundation, it was before a strategy refinement. We went through strategy. We're evolving, right? Organizations are living organisms, right? So we change and we evolve and we adapt. And to tell you the truth, when I first showed up, the Sustainable Environments Program at the Serdna Foundation has always been committed to making the world a better place, broadly speaking. But to be honest, when I went in, the frame was about infrastructure, right? A thing. How can we make a thing, a highway, a water system, or whatever, more sufficient and sustainable? And it occurred to us that when the institution decided to become a social justice foundation, that we didn't see people anywhere in that theory of change. Where are the people? And what people? And for whom? And to what end, right? And so that really inspired us to go on a journey, and it was not just one program, it was all 3 programs, Thriving Cultures, Inclusive Economy, but for Sustainable Environments Program, what that meant is, 1, centering people of color, understanding that the end for us as an environments program was actually racial justice, okay? And by doing that, all right, then we are positioning ourselves to respond to what movements require of us, right? Which is to break down our silos, okay? It's not about having, necessarily, and No shade, okay? No shade to folks who organize their work in a particular manner, but I'm just sharing our journey, right? So having a water portfolio or having a transportation portfolio, that's not how folks live. They don't wake up every day, thinking about, one thing or the other. They think about all of these things all at once, all the time. So what is the opportunity that we have understanding this in philanthropy, right, to reorganize ourselves so that we can just respond to that, right? Respond to it. And so I think that the work that BLP is doing, or my role, is to create that bridge, right? To create that bridge and to show up the same way in the Black land and power space that I do in my boardroom, right? With my trustees, right? And with all of you, all my philanthropic colleagues, right? In all the spaces, right, that we are in as philanthropy that we don't invite movement folks into, so.
Thank you. Thanks, friends. It's a pleasure working with you. Oh, okay. Really quickly.
Great. So just both a ask and a demand. So my comrade Mary Hooks, the co-director of Southerners on New Ground, made a mandate for Black people. And although I see some of my siblings in here, overwhelmingly not. So I'm not going to say the whole mandate, but there is one piece that I think is relevant and important. And that's to be willing to be transformed in the service of the work. And so when you think about all of the conversations that we're going to be inside of today, and when you think about what this means for how you actualize your work, I think above and beyond that is what are you willing to do to be transformed?
That's a really beautiful transition into our next conversation, being led by my colleague Jennifer Neer, in terms of how do we get there, right? So as we're trying to be transformed through the work and in the work, how do we get there? Thank you so much.
We're going to be a little transparent and do some on-the-fly weaving and facilitation. We're going to start by going a little bit deeper into this question about how do we move, what are the practices that we really need, what are the ways in which we must align in philanthropy. And I think specifically, when we're talking about the regenerative economy, a lot of the times people will say like, oh, well, I don't have an endowment, or I'm not able to make low interest, zero or interest loans. And I think one of the things we want to start off is by lifting up all the ways and mechanisms through which we can be moving in alignment rather than creating the conditions against these folks. And so to start, and as folks go along, if you just want to introduce and say a little bit about yourselves, we're moving quickly and we're dropping kind of in a conversation that's already happening, just so folks realize. So I'm just going to start with Morningstar and invite you to share a little bit more about some of the current conditions that you're working in and the ways that folks can practice and be in alignment.
So again, I just want to say thank you, Sisulei, and acknowledge that we are here on Ohlone land. We are all guests here. My homeland is 5 hours north of here. And what's coming up for me when, how it is that we can move forward, I'm thinking, of what I spoke to earlier, of being the issue of invisibility for Indigenous peoples on Indigenous lands. And particularly here in California, we have, when the treaties were made here in California with our tribes, there were 18 treaties that were made that were not ratified. And so there are treaty obligations that have not been fulfilled. And so I think about the issue everyone, I think that there's maybe a misconception even when we think about the issues around Standing Rock, and that Standing Rock is over and done with, right? But right here across the bay at Federal Correctional Institution in Dublin, FCI Dublin, our sister Red Fawn Fallis is serving her sentence, her 5-year sentence there. And she's there with aunties and with sisters and our two-spirit relatives. And so that's a facility that I used to volunteer at 10 years ago. So I was attending Mills College, and I was on this beautiful private campus where I would walk on, and there wasn't, hardly anyone that looked like me there. But I would walk into the federal prison on the weekends to a room full of women where everyone looked like me. And so how is it that, we can move forward when there is such an injustice that has been done to our peoples on our own lands? And so that's part of the work that I continue to do, and standing in the strength and in, really standing solid in knowing that this work that we're doing is spiritual work, that this work that we're doing is not only connected to our movements and to movement spaces, but it is very much that we are doing the work that Creator intended for us to do. And so it was really, it really helped to change my perception of things. I've been doing a lot of sacred sites volunteer protection work over the past 15 years now for my sacred homelands of Medicine Lake. Medicine Lake flows into the Fall River, which flows into the Pitt River, which flows into the Sacramento River, which flows right here to the San Francisco Bay Delta. And so anything that affects our sacred waters back home, when we have the possibility of contamination, and we were fighting geothermal energy extraction back home, that's contaminating our whole waterway throughout here through Northern California. And so this past summer, I made 2 visits up to Mauna Kea, and just really sat behind the kapuna tent and sat there behind the elders and just watching the interactions. And it was just so beautiful to me how they sat there in so much love, and in the kapua aloha and the sacred aloha, and they held that mountain in so much love and so much dedication. And so that's how, in terms of changing even my personal everyday, my decision in terms of how I move throughout the day, really standing in that strength of those elders that are holding that mountain with so much love.
So I actually might just stay with you for a second, Morningstar, before we shift. So I loved the way that Amaka framed that it's like we're moving in these 2 different economies, right? And we have to calibrate to the totality of them together. And again, it fits really well in the just transition framework around stopping the old and building the new. And as we are working to organize and build the regenerative economy, we're also still experiencing the harm of the old, which means there's got to be divestment and organizing and power building to stop that harm. So you were just sharing a little bit with me this morning, a very in real time live example where you could use support from the philanthropic community. So do you want to just say a little bit more about how funders can align in stopping that harm?
Sure. There's been a lot of conversations around the divestment of TMT, of the 30-meter telescope for Mauna Kea, and it's the foundation right here in the Bay Area, the Betty and Gordon Moore Foundation. So this is a $315 million annual budget, $6.4 billion endowment. And so what does that look like when the foundations and right here in the Bay Area have mostly been silent around that? Our relatives are here constantly educating the efforts around why the TMT needs to be stopped, on why we don't need an additional telescope up on the mountain. And so I just invite you to help to think about different ways that when we're really committed to divestment and when we're really committed to regenerative economies, what that looks for our elders that are currently up there on the sacred Mauna Kea.
So I'm going to shift us a little bit, but Nick and I also checked in just a little bit earlier before we started about some of the real-time political conditions back home in South Dakota for Nick. And I think, again, it's another example of how do we look to connect stopping the bad political power building to this new economic and cultural power building and regenerative economy that we so desperately need and we're trying to live into. So do you want to share a little bit more about your work and what's happening right now?
Nick Tilson Amachiapi. I greet you in my Lakota language. My name is Nick Tilson. I'm from the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation, Porcupine, South Dakota. But most importantly, a father of 4 wild Oglala kids that range from 9 years old up to 16, all who participated in direct action at Standing Rock. Yeah, I'm a little bit torn because there's a lot I want to share about what Indian Collective is doing, which I'll get to. But also, about 3 hours ago, the South Dakota State Legislature just introduced a new riot-boosting bill to criminalize protesting against the KXL pipeline. And it's a piece of legislation that basically outlaws not only those organizing on the ground and criminalizing the behavior, but those who are supporting us. And this is a whole national movement to criminalize our right, our right to organize in this whole country. And there's a whole string of a set of new laws that were created post Standing Rock to criminalize all of our collective movements to one another. And so that's the thing that I walk in here when we were talking, like, I was talking with somebody on the phone and they're like, I'm going to this thing called State of the Movement. And they're like, what, is there only one? I'm coming in there heavy on that because these are structural things that will change and transform our ability to organize, to move resources. And the reality is we're not going to stop organizing or fighting in these political times. But we're gonna have to, this is the environment in which we're going to do that, meaning our risk is heavily increased. And so I wanted to say that because it's, as soon as I leave this meeting, that's what we're working on. And I was sitting there texting the whole time. The work of Indian Collective, and to be clear, it's Indian Collective, it's Indian, it's just slang. Don't worry about it. A lot of times people are like, oh my God, am I allowed to say that? It's just, yeah, we've kind of had fun with it. But our work is really, we've recognized that about 0.4% of all philanthropy in America goes to indigenous people. I started as a community organizer when I was 17, 20 years ago, and that statistic has not changed. And I spent my entire adult life in the sector and organizing, engaging with all kinds of different philanthropic institutions, all big, small, family, all kinds of different money. And I had the opportunity to do a lot of organizing in my home community on Pine Ridge, where we did some really awesome catalytic work of building an entire 21st century community from scratch. And I know there's some folks in the room who've been there down at Thunder Valley. And it's an amazing example of what's possible when you mobilize your community, build housing. I would say we were organizers turned accidental community developers, and we were better than most people who've been developing for a long time. And through that work, we realized we needed to transform the system because even post Standing Rock, there's a decline in philanthropy to Native people. Even in the moment of visibility, of global visibility, and it's because white supremacy lives in philanthropy. And so we came to the conclusion, and I approached this as an organizer, not so much an entrepreneur, but came to this as a conclusion that we have to build indigenous and people of color-led philanthropic institutions with people with lived experience on the ground. And that's just hard. That means that people are having to give up money and decision-making power and put it into the hands of people who have lived experience in doing that work. And so we can sit in these conferences and we can talk one after another, but until we actually make that shift, until people realize one of their act of radical courage is to give up the power in which they have been passed down to them in a generation and give it back to the people who are closest to the pain and closest to the problem. And so because I'm Indigenous and I'm wild Oglala, all of our work is focused on doing that for Indigenous people. So Indian Collective launched about, 19, 20 months ago, something like that, with this idea that we're going to build the biggest philanthropic fund at $50 million annual of grant making by Indigenous people for Indigenous people. It'll be the biggest philanthropic fund that has ever existed in the history of philanthropy that's dedicated to Indigenous people. And the reason we're doing that is not because our people just need $50 million annually. We need more than that, just put that out there. But it represents a fundamental shift in power. Because if Indigenous people become the biggest funder of Indigenous people, who's setting the dinner table then? Who's setting the agendas? Because the agendas that are being set are 10 times more powerful than the money itself. And so this is a power building strategy. And so, and we're also playing with the other 95% of philanthropy because we're creating a $100 million investment fund. We're also launching an organizing and direct action arm of our collective so that it keeps our philanthropy and our investment arm accountable to its movement, to its people. And so, and all of this has been based out of lived experience. So this idea didn't grow out of philanthropy in a trickle-down process. It grew out of roots in the ground amongst the Indigenous people's movement, and it has to continue staying true to that for it to have the impact that we're trying to have in the world.
Thank you.
Oh, just one more thing.
Yeah.
The Bay Area threw down for us in Standing Rock. A lot of people in this room. And being somebody who wrangles with philanthropy, watching that money flow and the resources and the way in which people mobilized for our cause and for our movement, and that was in my home territory, I just want to say that we're really grateful, and that is only the beginning of what our movement has the ability to do.
So a couple of things that we talk about at Justice Funders as we move through this work is we try to think about like the level of systemic harm and oppression that has happened, that's currently happening. So we also talk about how do we calibrate our response to that, and we look to communities and to organizing models like NDN and the work that these folks are doing to really understand, like, how do we need to calibrate in alignment with them? And that means, you know, some of what I'm hearing is we've got to divest from things that are harming and killing us. We've got to invest in C4 strategies and long-term grassroots leadership, political organizing. We need zero interest loans, and we need to give up control of the capital, just to name a few, right? That's just the starting list of what we all could do in this room that would be helpful. So one of the other things we talk about is like we're moving through ecosystems and we're wearing a lot of different hats, and all of this is rooted in relationship. And so I want to turn to Daisy now just to talk a little bit about how you all are wearing a lot of different hats as you're trying to align with these different bodies of work, and what does that look like for you?
Seguli Swagwag, Daisy Miyogyats, Anaya de Aga, Niwaguhujot, Anawal, Niwagidalot. Hi everyone, my name is Daisy Francor. I'm a citizen of the United Nations of Wisconsin, and I'm the Director of Sustainability at the Cultural Conservancy, headquartered in the Presidio of San Francisco, and you can learn a little bit more about us at nativeland.org. But the Cultural Conservancy, we've been around for 35 years. We are an Indigenous-led, Indigenous rights, Indigenous women-led, organization. We do a lot of work, anything from philanthropy, right? We have, we're going on our 7th cycle of the Minonibi Fund for Indigenous Cultures, which means sharing good water. And we fund folks through the indigenous peoples through the Americas and the Pacific, and here on Turtle Island, otherwise known as the United States. We focus a lot on really protecting and restoring indigenous cultures and empowering them in their direct application of traditional knowledge on their ancestral lands. And at the core of it, our values are self-determination and honoring that and the people that we work with, the peoples that we work with, truly. And yeah, we go in and out of wearing many hats, some all at the same time, right? Of being an indigenous-led funder, being a grassroots organizer, being a mobilizer, being an intermediary, being all of these things with limited resources, right? I was just talking with my COO, and we're, finalizing our budget for 2020, and 60% of our budget is salaries, personnel, and funders don't want to fund personnel. They don't want to fund salaries. And so the hardest thing to fundraise for is, general support, and that's what makes most of our budget. But yet we still find ways to do good work with or without resources, financial resources. And so through that, what we've learned is that, and myself that I've learned as entering philanthropy, first at the Christensen Fund, being a program officer there, is that it's really hard to be an indigenous person in philanthropy. It is a system, money itself, that's all dirty money that was built off of the backs of indigenous peoples, built off the backs of our lands and natural resources, including all black and brown bodies, right, that are here. And so we struggle with still finding a way that we have to prove ourselves to philanthropy, that we know how to self-determine our own futures. Still in 2020, we have to prove to people that we know what's best for our communities, as if we weren't here since time immemorial. But that's just some of the things that we're kind of grappling with right now, in addition to making sure that our communities are healthy, that our partners are healthy, right? And that means more ways than one. That includes their physical well-being, right? And through our Native Foodways program, restoring or revitalize native foodways so that our peoples are eating their ancestral foods, as we all struggle. Many indigenous people struggles with diabetes and many other health disparities. We're doing our best to support the spiritual aspect of their ways of being and knowing, and their connections to land and natural resources and the environment. And so really recognizing that both with all the programs that we have, each as a people, as peoples, the interdependent relationships that we all hold within ourselves, and the many programs that we hold, and the importance of those relationships, and that we're not operating in silos.
Thank you. I'm so tempted to ask one more question, but I think unless there's any final thoughts, we'll shift into reflection, and then we'll have more time to dig in Q&A. Do you want to share one last thing? Yeah.
One of the biggest challenges that we have, of course, like you can go across the movement and talk about that throughout indigenous communities, we need to see, long-term, six-figure grant making that is in, that's general operating support and investing in that way into our communities. But the more and more, in addition to that, I'm always like both and, is the political climate that we're organizing in. I mean, we're against the biggest corporations in the world who are ahead of us, rewriting laws, buying off politicians, and we're putting so much risk out there. I mean, when I was arrested in Standing Rock and charged with a felony. At the time, I was the executive director of the Thunder Valley Community Development Corporation. I had 120 employees in the poorest place in America at the time. And the over-criminalization of what's happening in our movement it's massive. And it is a huge risk. And so, and I was sitting in these foundation meetings, and people talk about risk. And I'm sitting there thinking, what the hell are you talking about? So as I say that, like one of the things, we have built a legal strategy within the structure at NDN Collective, and recognizing that we have to be able to use C4 structures and LLC structures, not only for business ventures, but for direct action and organizing and for protecting our movements and protecting our people. But for that strategy to work, it means that people have to put money in our C4s. And there's almost no money going into that. And in C4s for organizing and direct action work, not just for the 2020 election, but that too, and both.
Thanks. I'm really glad you shared that. We talk a lot and we look to folks like NDN. A lot of folks might know another incredible organizing project in Boston, Ujima. I don't know if we have Ujima folks in the house, but we'll cheer for them. And I think what you name is so important because the folks who have the burden of the most risk from this extractive, harmful capitalist economy need to have the least amount of risk as we move forward. And I think it's really important for philanthropy to reorient itself to that concept of risk and really think about how to move in alignment with that in the way that it structures resources. So hopefully when we come back up all together, we'll have a little more time to dig into the ways that funders in the room can really align. But just want to say thank you so much for sharing your stories. Let's give these folks a round of applause. A couple things I just want to name as we shift into this is when we were originally thinking about the design for this program, we were thinking about how can we lift up bodies of work and sort of a set of relationships that help to illustrate the level of ecosystem and coordination and strategy of folks on the ground. And part of the challenge in doing that is that we have a number of funders who aren't yet moving in great alignment with these bodies of work. So it's actually fairly hard to find a grassroots leader, a national alliance group, and a funder that are moving together in deep relationship. And so what we want to do now is we really want to think about what is the relationship across these different ecosystems? How is Black land and power work really connected to indigenous organizing and economic development work? And how is community control of housing and land trusts really connected to rematriation of land? So we want to start to tease out some of those links. And we'll take a second just to look at the questions, but we actually just want to take a beat too from the last conversation and loop back and really just open up to our folks to talk a little bit more about indigenous solutions for philanthropy and really get more into the practices for funders in the room. And I would add into that too, indigenous-led practices around how we redistribute land, capital, and power beyond just grants and philanthropy. So Daisy, do you want to kick us off?
Yawa, thank you. To get into the nitty-gritty of the solutions, there's many, and the many up here have those solutions, and so please go to them as well. But I think what I see a lot in the Bay Area is a lot of talk about DEI, right? Diversity, equity, inclusion. And what I rarely see in these conversations is any conversation about supporting or even centering Indigenous peoples' self-determination and our rights. And I see a lot in philanthropy, or an uprising and funding human rights, but not funding Indigenous rights, which is very similar to human rights, but also very different. It's more of a collective rights rather than individual. And in order to meet these goals of equity, we have to center Indigenous sovereignty, and that starts with making sure that your institutions are representative of the communities you support. So that means hiring Indigenous peoples as staff, as board members, as experts, as advisors, without any form of tokenization, that they are actually valuable and have something to contribute. And it also means that we have to really work in deeper relationship with one another and move from a transactional way of grant grant making to reciprocal and building partnerships. And when you have trust in one another, then you don't need as much time in grant reporting. And it gives more time to those on the ground doing good work to actually do the work. And so we actually need to take time to reflect on our own systems and how we're helping rather than hurting the communities who are doing the work that are saving all of humankind for us.
I would just add that, you know, there was something that happened in this last year and a half, where the city of Eureka returned Indian Island, Tolawat, the sacred island, back to the community of Wiyot peoples back home where they are not afforded federal recognition. And so that's a model that we can use in terms of land back, right? And when we talk about, you know, as Nick mentioned, you know, fundamentally, how philanthropy is rooted within white supremacy, we also need to talk about how it's rooted in patriarchy and how patriarchy thrives throughout philanthropy. And so as Native peoples, as women that are putting our lives on the line, that have children, small children to care for at home, and how, you know, through the frontline defense of constantly having to fight these battles for protection of our environments, for the right to be able to prey on our sacred lands and within our areas. You know, how is that conversation being integrated into, again, regenerative economies, especially right here in the Bay Area? So I just wanted to add that.
The other things I would add on to that a little bit is that from a community-based practitioner perspective, blended capital solutions work. They work all over the places. And they work in Indian country too. And I think that also, when it comes to putting that into practice, what I keep finding is that indigenous folks aren't given the opportunity to be in the position to house within themselves the capital to deploy blended capital solutions. So, and so that's part of what we're building at NDN. And what I mean by blended capital is grant money and low interest money into the hands of indigenous people to work with other indigenous people so that we have the flexibility to build those unique relationships, to actually build the capacity needed to make sure that those resources actually have the impact they need to have. So I think blended capital, but that doesn't mean saying, like, let's have this indigenous person get this PRI and then have to run around and find all grant money from this person, and this person. Let's build those institutions led by indigenous people and people of color. And I think the other one is directly impacted and indigenous-led efforts. So Indian Collective only funds organizations in which boards are 100% indigenous, in which staffs are 70% indigenous and 100% of the leadership. If you break down the statistics of our historically limited funds that go to indigenous communities, a lot of them are going to organizations that are serving indigenous people. That's an entirely different thing. It's not a power building strategy. And to be honest, it's also, there's a bunch of dope ass Native people that are doing work who've got white folks on their board because they're like, shit, why don't they give us access? Right? And so it's another white supremacist construct that makes its way into our work. And so we have to think about how we're radically pushing that to change it and to build, to build new institutions and not redevelop or recycle the same constructs that have created the problems that we're in.
So I'd love to jump into one of our questions. And Nick, you kind of set us up for this earlier when you started to actually talk about elections and the role of the C4 as another mechanism or a strategy that we can use to actually create change. And I'd invite anybody to take this question. I think, Chris, you may be able to talk to talk about it from the perspective of the Movement for Black Lives electoral table. Dom used to do some C4 work back in the day together. But I'm wondering if we can take a moment to both kind of talk about what it looks like to actually be able to leverage other legal entity models beyond the 501c3, namely kind of the LLC model, the 501c4 model, the 501c2 model around land trust. What are other mechanisms that we can use to create transformative change? And what is the type of capital that we need to do that? And if there's anybody from background in philanthropy that wants to speak about what it looks like to actually move money into these type of vehicles and strategies as well, I would welcome it. But I think we have a floating mic for anybody who wants to speak to that.
Yeah, so I could jump in. So 2 things came up for me in the Black Land and Power Project. We want to hold land, so we're looking at other models like a 501c2 to help do that. And so it's a learning process for us. You know, I thought I knew all the C's, I knew the 3s, I knew the 4s, and then it was like, no, it's some other shit, there's 2 stuff. So it's a learning process for us as organizers and movement leaders. And then in the Movement for Black Lives, we run the Electoral Justice Project, and we were able to not only support a whole bunch of community-based organizations to start C4s, but also resource C4s. So we were able to move a lot of money on the ground in order for folks to be able to actualize electoral strategies that were rooted in power building, because it's, you know, the way that folks historically do electoral organizing doesn't actually get the long-term goods. And so we're living inside of the Tea Party's 10-year strategy. We're 9 years in, right? What was politically possible on the right 10 years ago, what was not politically possible on the right 10 years ago is now politically possible. And so we're invested in trying to build that on the left, a really radical democracy. And so we need all the vehicles we can fucking imagine.
Thank you for the question, Marka. So I think a couple of things, agree with what Carissa put out, and also just talking about the connections that are cool. One of the first times I ever did C4 work was actually working on a campaign to try to elect Wilson Riles mayor of Oakland. And Wilson is part of Carissa's family. So that's, what year was that, Carissa?
2002.
That's right, okay. We lost, but we've been organizing since though, so it doesn't matter. So I think around the question, around the C4 structure, so it's resonate with the comments that like, we need that money. Many of us are actively leaning into the strategy, trying to engage it in a way that actually is transformative instead of very transactional. Most of our communities are deeply alienated from the methodology and the approach of electoral organizing, whether you're talking about the kind that is being done by the parties, or the kind that actually has historically kind of the parachute model into the communities every time the election cycle comes around. So I think that for those in philanthropy, some of the things that I would say is or donors, actually, because this is where the donor game is really strong and the donor dollars are, is to look beyond the candidate campaigns, which are critical and strategic, if done in a critical and strategic way by critical and strategic forces who are really thinking long term. I think the candidate fights are important and they can be very advancing, but I think you have to apply a very critical lens. So much money goes there in a way that actually doesn't serve most of the communities, folks, those of us who are organizing in the communities up here. So I think how can there be a much more clear, critical, and strategic set of criteria applied to when money is going to candidate and candidate work? Secondly, in our network, the leading edge of the electoral organizing is around the initiative fights. So earlier, Lisa was talking about the rent control, and it's interesting. So the flip side of the 10-year Tea Party strategy is what Lisa was talking about, in that we're seeing in a very short amount of time, because of strong local organizing, openings around rent control, for example, which for a long time and many of you know, it was a political third rail in the equivalent of the housing landscape. It was a third rail, right? It was the thing that if you said, you got singled out as, you got red baited, you were politically marginalized. I mean, here in Oakland, as a local organizer, we were cut off from access for 10 years by a city council person who was like, as long as those words come out of your mouth, I will never meet with you, right? So it was the flip side is that organizing is creating those kinds of shifts where we are seeing opportunities. So really thinking about how can we get resources to these campaigns that are actually very much a part of this broader strategy that folks locally are moving. Now, the third and final thing I'll say, there's a lot more to say, but the third and final thing I'll say about this is that a lot of this for us is messy because it's not just work that is being driven by organizations who have the pre-existing infrastructure. A lot of this is about trying to get these C4 dollars to groups and formations that in some cases are volunteer-based. In some cases, they are not incorporated organizations, right? So I think that it's both this, it's both about thinking about how to drive the money, but really to some extent leaning into the challenges and the complexity of the way in which the work is happening right now. And that diversity of tactic, that diversity of actually supporting complex movement ecosystems that don't look like organizations you recognize or names you know or people, people whose names you feel like you're reading about on Twitter or whatever. It's like how do we actually open up to the complexities, because altogether it's the C4 within a broader context of a diversifying, complexifying movement ecosystem. And if you're gonna be supporting and leaning into the work that's really moving and mattering right now, that's the kind of thing you're gonna have to develop an appetite for.
So I'm gonna put these questions together. One is, what are the bright spots in influencing philanthropy? Where are folks starting to see shifts that are meaningful? And connected to that, there's a question that says, what are restorative economic practices that build Black and Indigenous solidarity, where grant makers' giving is transformed as an act of reparations? Thank you, Alan, for that question, for handing it to me. So I think we can take those together because we can look at what are the bright spots of influencing philanthropy into moving into a reparations frame. I would also invite folks to speak to the way in which they're organizing structure to receive those kind of resources, if that feels more applicable.
Yeah, thank you for the question, and thank you for teeing it up by talking about acquisition of land. So I would say that one bright spot that we're seeing in Boston is a recognition by a small group, a small but powerful group of social justice funders, a couple of whom are in the room right now, who are looking at funding a movement ecosystem that makes possible community control of land and housing. And so what I mean by that is funding not just the organizing groups on the ground like City Life that are doing the anti-eviction, anti-displacement work, but also the coalitions that we are part of. So City Life is part of and anchors the Right to the City Boston Coalition. So movement funders fund both the organizing and the coalition, but not just the coalition. They also fund the community land trust that we co-parented in order to provide the next level of the organizing, which is the community control of land and housing that we get when we win from these developers and these big banks. But not just that, also funding the process that gives birth to something like the Boston Ujima Project, which we are also co-parents of, right? So funders who see the ecosystem, right? They see it as their duty to fund all of what makes it possible, the organizing and the experiments. And then the last thing that I'll say is it is the blended capital strategy. It is not just philanthropic dollars. To the Land Trust and to UJIMA, which is a community-controlled ecosystem in and of itself, which includes a loan fund, it is both, it's the philanthropic dollars, it is thinking about how to get at the other 95% through strategic investment in community investing, right? And looking at low or negative returns on your investment, right? Things like that. And it's also doing the kind of organizing, not just of philanthropy, but of social impact investors to also put money into a pool so that building acquisition, rehabilitation, all of the social supports that are necessary when you're talking about people controlling their own land and housing together. There's a number, so anyway, blended capital is important, and we need more people, more philanthropy funding in that ecosystem way.
I think that funding Black and Indigenous solidarity is a whole nother panel and conference here in itself. I want to acknowledge my sister Carissa here for her initiative through Seeding Resistance, where she invited community members, and it was international, and an international youth initiative of Black and Indigenous youth that were focused on food sovereignty and on land and what that looked like. And so it was here in Oakland. And so I want to acknowledge the history here in Oakland, that as a little Indian girl, the way that I was able to eat breakfast in the morning was through the Black Panther Party, through their free breakfast program, right? That's how us as little Indian kids were able to eat, through that deep solidarity and resistance of our movements, through the Black Panther Party, American Indian movement, and how that continues today through the solidarity between our movements and showing up for each other. And so that's not something that's easily funded. Building these relationships with each other, being in community, having these conversations about what it means to own stolen land, right? And what it means to provide those healthy foods and grow those foods for our own people in our own communities. But I just wanted to acknowledge Carissa and pass the mic if there's anything she wants to add to that.
I love you. Yeah, I think that, oftentimes when we're inside of relationships with funders, they're like, what is the outcome? And it's hard to be able to label authentic relationship building across two communities that have been devastated by settler colonialism. And it's important to acknowledge that there are also, come on, clap me up. And it's important to acknowledge that there are Black Indigenous people. My mother is Mohawk, my father is Black, my mother's Mohawk and French Canadian. So also not invisibilizing that there are folks who sit at the intersection of both of those identities. And so, yeah, find some folks who are interested. The Movement for Black Lives, as we just put out a platform around reparations, the Black Land and Power Project, which many members flow throughout, where we want to be in right relationship with Indigenous comrades. And we recognize that Black folks, as a landless people in this country, need land in order to be self-determining people. And so how do we do that in right relationship? And so it's a conversation that we started to formulate with some young folks, and we're really excited to now take that into some other generations and deepen that conversation. So throw Morningstar some money. Okay, bye.
Liberate the funds, pass them on, free them up, and I think just to really, what comes to mind is a quote from Cliff Albright that says relationships are infrastructure. So that's the just transition of our portfolios, right? How are we looking at relationships? How are we defining what infrastructure we should be investing in? It's a long-term proposition. It's about putting power building, right, as sort of your North Star, okay? Not the campaign. It's not about winning this piece of legislation, because that's just the beginning, okay? So you need to be willing to, one, step back, listen, to find the ecosystems that exist. And if you follow relationships, okay, and invest in those, then you will wind up looking and saying, oh, these are all grantee partners, okay? You know, and that's the truth. And it wasn't because we, you know, we were so, you know, we had all the expertise and we went and we created this magical portfolio. And that's not what the hell we did. Because you know that, because we asked y'all, hey girl, hey, what should we be doing? And you told us, and we listened, and we had those courageous conversations. And we had the education, which is still ongoing, to explain why it is important not only to fund like right to the city, but also, you know, NDN, to fund Movement for Black Lives, and then fund the majority. All of these things, yes, they overlap. It is not either or. Redundancy is required, okay, for what it is that we need to get done, okay? And I think that over and over what we've heard is that we have been funding folks just enough to fail, okay? It ain't the first time that we heard that. It's not the first time I've heard it. And so, but we don't have to keep doing that. Amaka called us in, it's about the practice of choice. You know, when we have those decision-making points, when we're taking a look, as we do in our sector every 4 or 5 years. Come on, y'all. Really? Yes. Okay, we can clap on that. Come on now, because you know, if you're not in a strategy refinement, you're about to go into one tomorrow, and you know you just got out of one yesterday. Let's be real. Okay, but that is what it is. But those are opportunities to practice choice. And we are here, and they're telling us what it is we need to do in those moments. Okay, so yeah, they're giving us, you know, the work and the answers. We just need to listen.
So I want to just add to something that you said, because we're talking a lot about ecosystems, right? And we're applying it to philanthropy. But I'm a farmer, so when you start talking about ecosystems, my blood starts to go. And so, you know, there is a way to actually build an ecosystem that is self-generating, you know, self-correcting, and it doesn't require much intervention or maintenance. We see them all the time. They're called forests, right? And some of them have been on the planet for thousands of years. And it doesn't matter where you go, but from the ground all the way to the big, tall trees, everything is in its perfect place where it goes. And so in my backyard, I have this 80-year-old fig tree, right? Every single year, I don't have to water it. I don't have to touch it. And then every year, what I can do is I can clip off a little branch, and I just go put it in soil. Guess what? That branch turns into another fig tree. And then I do that 20, 30 times every single year. And so with the type of work that we've been doing over the last 10 years, we're getting to the point to where we can be that fig tree that you can take those branches off of and be able to start to plant other fig trees that once they get going, then they will also be these self-generating and self-replicating systems. But until you do that, there's a lot of resources that have to go into that tree, because when it's first in the ground, it needs water, it needs to be protected from the sun, all those different things. And so for us, we're at a point to where we've gotten some grants and we've got some physical sponsorships, but it's just enough, like it was said, just enough to be dangerous, right? Not enough to be able to move from like a 70-30, then a 40-60, then a 50-50, and then finally to a point to where we can say, you know what? We don't need that anymore. We have enough resources, our roots are deep enough, and we have the infrastructure, you know, we've been pruning our tree to be able to continue to what? Be able to plant and show others how to do this. So as I'm looking and talking about an ecosystem, then it's time to put the resources up so that we can build those ecosystems inside of our communities so that they can finally be self-replicating.
Yep.
I just wanted to add one of the questions was, what are some examples of people being in good relationship with one another? I think leading with action and stop talking around the problem forever. And just recently had awesome interactions with folks with Candide, Alameda Fund, Restorative Economies, folks with Regan, and we were having these conversations about all these badass ways we were gonna move money and talk about doing things. And it was an exciting conversation. And I was watching the clock get like towards the end of the call, you know, and I was like, shit, how are we gonna like make the best of our time? And I'm always telling my staff, like, don't waste your time. Our time is our most valuable thing, which it is, right? And it occurred to me, like, we could talk around this problem or this thing forever. And I wasn't even pitching ideas that were like things that we needed money for, because it was just on our priorities of things that felt like we were talking to this particular funder about. It wasn't even in the top 10. But then I was sitting there and I was like, hey, one way for us to build a relationship with one another is I got a project that's happening like next week that needs money like right now. And here's an opportunity for you and for me to build a relationship so that we can start to look at these bigger areas. And this is like small peanuts, you know? We were doing like a $1.4 million project to buy a piece of land. And within like 1 week, they called us back, I think like 5 days later, and we're like, hey, here's we got a check for like $300,000 to close on this property. And then like 2 weeks ago, we closed on it, right? So I just use that as an example because now we're in relationship with one another, right? And so now like we got people. And when we start having each other's back in that way, our ability to build power and move collectively, like, you know, the sky's the limit.
So I'm in a moment, have Dana come back up to close us out, but want to just once again thank all of our speakers, our panelists, our workers, our doers. Appreciate you. Thank you so much, Jennifer. I think oftentimes when we have these conversations, we look to people to tell us, like, give us the one thing, right? Like, what's the one thing that's really going to shift it all? And what we've seen is that these are organizations, these are communities that are holding multiple strategies, right? Stirring multiple pots all at the same time, keeping it going. And we're inviting philanthropy, our funders, our investors to also kind of hold that complexity, hold that depth of visionary strategies, and understand that we're not saying that you have to do it alone, right? We actually get to be a we together, in movement together, doing that. And so invite you all to kind of stay, mingle, and get to know these individuals. Let's actually start to cultivate the real relationships that help us to transform. So thank you so much, and Dana, would love to have you come back.
Please join me in thanking this fabulous group. We just appreciate y'all being willing to come through, share your stories, share your experiences, call us in. I also want to thank my team, Jennifer, Amaka, and also please give it up for Jamie Carter and Maria Nakai. So as we've heard this afternoon, our movements today are being led by some of the most innovative and creative folks who are drawing from ancestral wisdom to practice democratic governance, build their own economies, reclaim buildings, land, and power. Today, we had the privilege of hearing just a few of these examples. We at Justice Funders look forward to being able to be in right relationship with all of you in philanthropy, to move resources to change these conditions, transform systems, and build the world that works for all of us. While this is the largest event of ours this year, it represents the kind of analysis, content, and nuance that you will find across our programs. So if you're not yet a member of the Bay Area Justice Funders Network, I encourage you to join. And can I actually ask those of you in the room who are members of BadgeFin to please stand? If you've participated in any of our leadership programs this year, Harmony or Maestra, please stand. If you've worked with us in our consulting practice, please stand. If you're a movement group who has participated in one of the development director dialogues, please stand. We want to appreciate those of you who've taken the time to build with us. You are our ecosystem, and this is the way that we are going to build collective power. Thank you all so much, and we'll see you next year.